Thank you very much, Nin, and thank you again to Visco for sponsoring this session. Are you all convinced you need more protein in your diets now? Right? Raise your hand. That should have sunk in. Our speaker's convinced. And we're going to have it earlier in the day, right? That's the two messages I got. Now, in reality, it gets down to we need to have ingredients that we're going to utilize as product developers and put them in products so we have products available so you can eat them. So I'm going to pick up where the last speaker took off and talk about how we formulate foods and what ingredients we have that are protein based. When I get done, Mary Ann's going to finish it off and she's going to tell us how to make sure they taste good. Right? So the three talks, even though they're pretty broad, actually fit together pretty well. So I just want to make sure you're convinced you need to start out by having more protein. So I'm going to talk about how we make a product called whey protein isolate. I'll talk a little bit about whey protein concentrate as well, but I'm going to talk about how that's made. From that point, I'm going to talk about what the properties of whey protein are and what whey proteins are present. From there, I'm going to talk about the functionality of those proteins and how they interact and how they impact foods when we use them as ingredients in foods. And last of all, I'll talk about things you should look out for as you formulate with whey protein isolate. Has anybody here made cheese? A few hands go up. One of my favorite pastimes is making cheese. A bad thing about cheese manufacture, though, is when you make 10 pounds of cheese, you're going to end up, when you make 1 pound of cheese, you have to start with 10 pounds of milk. And you're going to get that 1 pound of cheese, and you're going to get 9 pounds of a product called whey. So when I make cheese, 90% of what I started with ends up in what used to be a waste product. Right? When we look at what we do with that whey, we'll take that whey after cheese manufacture and we'll do what's called fines removal. There's some particles from the cheese manufacturing process that are there we want to remove. We want to take out any fat we can with a unit operation called separation with a cream separator. And then we may bleach the product. If you saw on the last slide that the cheese was yellow. In the United States, we make all kinds of yellow cheese. And people don't like yellow ingredients. When we try to use them in different food products, we don't want that color carrying through. So we'll use a process where we actually bleach the color away so our whey ingredients are white. Now, if we're making white cheese or mozzarella cheese, we don't need to bleach it. And we can have unbleached products. So in some markets, they'll want their whey-based ingredients to be unbleached. From that point, we'll pasteurize the whey. But we've got an ingredient, if you look at the gross composition, really is not all that useful. Because what's our main component? It's water. Almost 93.5% of whey is water. If we're talking about a dried ingredient we're going to use in food, that doesn't help us a whole lot. The most valuable component in whey is actually the protein. And unfortunately, it's one of the lowest amounts in our product. So the issue we have when we start with whey is we have a high value component, but it's at a very low level with a lot of water there. So to convert it into an ingredient that we can utilize, it's really about harvesting that protein and getting it into a form that we can now use as an ingredient. So that makes sense that we call it a whey protein isolate, because what we're really doing is isolating that whey protein from the whey. We have two major processes that we use to utilize that, or two different techniques. One is using processes called filtration, and then one is using a process called ion exchange. And in fact, with ion exchange, we'll also use it in conjunction with filtration. So to try to help you understand this, I've got to spend a little bit of time talking about filtration and what it is, and the same thing with ion exchange. So I'm going to do that as quickly as I can now. I want you to think about filtration as being a process that simply separates things based on what size they are. So on this slide, I've got different types of filtration. On the far left, I have MF, which is microfiltration. Then I have UF, which is ultrafiltration. Then I have NF, which is nanofiltration. And then I have RO, which is reverse osmosis. And each of those types of filtration differ only on the size of the pores in the membrane that I'm using. So if I'm using microfiltration, I can remove bacteria and fat from a product. If I'm using ultrafiltration, I can remove protein, and lactose and minerals and water will go through. In nanofiltration, I can remove lactose and anything bigger, and minerals will go through. And if I just want to remove water from a product, I use reverse osmosis. So how can I do this in a very efficient manner? So just to reinforce what I'm talking about, when we have filtration, we start with a membrane, and I'm showing you that on the slide. And we're going to take our material and we're going to run it parallel to that membrane across the surface of the membrane. So in this little schematic, I've got what I'm calling protein. You see the pink dot and the gray dot, and then I have water and lactose. The size of the holes in my membrane are large enough that the water and lactose can pass through the membrane and go into what's called the permeate, whereas the components that are the protein are larger than the holes in the membrane, and they'll be retained and they go into what's called the retentate. That's what happens when I do ultrafiltration. So if I take whey and I ultrafilter it, I'm going to remove water and lactose, and I'm going to keep protein and fat. Now if I do microfiltration, in this process the pores are bigger, and now some of the protein can actually go through the pores. And if I have fat or protein that's actually aggregated together and is bigger particles, it will be retained by the membrane. So I use microfiltration when I want to remove fat and aggregated protein from whey. Now how can I do this in an efficient manner? Because I talked about whey is very low in protein, and I've got a huge volume of whey that I need to process, so I need a way to do it very efficiently. And I do that with a membrane system called spiral wound membrane filtration. And what it does is that membrane I showed you on the last couple slides is actually rolled into what's called a spiral wound membrane, and what it does is gives me a very large amount of surface area that I can utilize to separate my whey. So this is just showing one cartridge of that membrane. When we actually go to a membrane manufacturing plant, we take several of those cartridges and put them in a module that gives us all kinds of surface area that allows us to process a very large amount of whey. So the typical cheese factory in the United States today would process in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 million pounds of whey a day. That's what they would process through their filtration system. So they need a very efficient system that has a large membrane capacity because they're trying to isolate a small amount of protein from a large amount of whey. So if we look at the actual process for manufacturing a whey protein isolate with with a filtration-based process, we'll first take the whey and go through ultrafiltration. And this is your quiz now. When I do that ultrafiltration, where is the protein going to go? Is it going to go in the retentate or the permeate? Come on, students. It's going to go in the retentate because it is larger than the membrane, so it's not going to go through. We're then going to take that material and we're going to do microfiltration on it now. In microfiltration, we're going to have a portion that's going to go in the permeate and a portion that's going to go in the retentate. What's going to go in the retentate? Remember that? Actual fat and aggregated protein are going to go in the retentate. Non-aggregated whey protein are going to go into the permeate. Now I have to take that permeate and I have to ultrafilter it one more time because I still have some lactose in there and I have to concentrate it before I dry it. So I'll ultrafilter it one more time, and then I finally have that retentate that I can dry and make a whey protein isolate. So a pretty complicated process with a lot of filtration in order to produce a whey protein isolate. Now my second process for potentially producing a whey protein isolate is to use a process called ion exchange. In ion exchange, we're trying to capture molecules based on the surface characteristics of those molecules. And we have two types of ion exchange. We have cation exchange or anion exchange. And on the left, I'm showing you anion exchange. It's called anion exchange because it attracts anions, which are negatively charged compounds. So to attract a negatively charged compound, I need a positively charged component that will capture the negative charge. And just the opposite when I do cation exchange. So the way this works is I have a reaction vessel that I have resin in, or resin beads, that are either cation or anion exchange, and they're going to trap compounds as I send them through. So in the ion exchange process, in my first step, I'm going to add Whey to my ion exchange system, and depending on the surface properties of the whey protein, they're going to stick to my resin. And then I can wash that resin and get all unbound components out of that material. My next step is then to do a pH adjustment or change the salt content, and then I can wash the protein that I was interested in off that resin. I'm then going to take that material, and it's going to have salt in it because of my salt that I've added or my pH adjustment. And I'm going to take that material and actually do ultrafiltration to remove that salt and have my native protein again. One advantage of ion exchange is I can change this resin, or I can change my characteristics of salt or pH adjustment and isolate very specific, highly pure components of the protein, and I can be selective about which proteins I actually want to harvest when I produce the whey protein isolate. In addition to that, there won't be any fat or any other minerals that are going to interact with that resin. I'm going to be able to remove those if I would like to. All right, so that was a really quick as I can, do an overview of the two types of processes you use to produce a whey protein isolate, a filtration-based and an ion exchange-based. To get into the rest of it and into the functionality, I have to talk a little bit about the individual proteins that are present in whey. So I said previously we have about 0.8% protein in whey. Of that protein, I'm showing you now the ratio of the different proteins that are present. The two most important proteins that we talk about the most are beta-lactoglobulin and alpha-lactoalbumin, and I'll spend most of my time on those two proteins. Beta-lactoglobulin is the most important because it makes up 50% of the protein that's present in whey. Alpha-lactoalbumin makes up 25%, and then the next major component is called glycomacropeptide. It's actually not a whey protein, it's actually a fragment from casein, which is a different protein in milk, and it actually gets lost during the cheese manufacturing process and goes into whey. So we call it a whey protein because it occurs in the whey. Its origin is actually from one of the casein proteins. In addition to that, we have some other proteins that are present at very low levels. I'm not going to really spend much time talking about them. I need to take just a quick moment before I go any further and talk about proteins and protein folding for you to understand the rest of it. Now, I hope you all know that proteins are made up of amino acids. And our amino acids are going to have, we typically will broadly classify them into two groups, hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And each protein, when it's placed in water or a biological environment, is going to fold into a very specific orientation. And it's going to do that based on hydrophilic amino acids wanting to interact with water and hydrophobic amino acids wanting to not interact with water. So I'm showing you that in a very simple schematic here, where the red dots are hydrophilic groups on the amino acid, and the green square is a hydrophobic group. The protein is going to fold into an orientation now where the hydrophobic portions are buried in the interior of the molecule, and the hydrophilic portions are on the outside of the molecule and can interact with water. This makes everybody happy. You know, it's like having two teenagers, brothers and sisters, and trying to get them to get along, right? They have to kind of be on opposite ends from each other, and then they can maybe be in the same car together, right? Proteins are the same way. We want the charged hydrophilic groups on the outside and happy because they interact with water, and the hydrophobic groups on the inside interacting with each other and not the water. We also have some other interactions in proteins. I've got them summarized here, but one of the key ones that I'll talk about in a little bit is a disulfide linkage. So you can have sulfur-containing amino acids that in a portion of the molecule, they'll form a permanent covalent bond that can stabilize the structure. And that's what I'm showing on the lower right-hand side there. So on to beta-lactoglobulin. Remember I said this is the major protein in whey protein. It makes up 50% of the protein. It's 162 amino acids in length. It has 2 disulfide bonds, so that's what I just talked about, that stabilize the molecule. I've got some additional information there, but a few things that I want to focus on that are more important for what I need to talk about next is that beta-lactoglobulin has excellent emulsification, foaming, and gelation properties. And I'll explain why that is in a little bit. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you the structure and talk about the components in that structure. So this 162 amino acid chain folds in a specific orientation. And that's what I'm actually showing on the slide now. And it actually kind of looks like a funnel. And this is a funnel that has all the hydrophobic groups on the inside of that funnel, so they're away from water. And we have hydrophilic groups on the outside, like I talked about what a typical globular protein would do. And then we have a disulfide bond in there that helps hold that structure together. We also have a free sulfhydryl group that's buried in that hydrophobic region as well. That becomes important when we talk about gelation and protein denaturation, and I'll refer to that when we get to that section. So next is alpha-lactoalbumin. It has about 25% of the total protein in whey, so it combined with beta-lactoglobulin is 75% of our protein, 123 amino acids. Some other information on it on this slide as well. But what I want to focus on is the foaming and gelation properties, and that it has a synergistic gelation with beta-lactoglobulin. So when we put those 2 proteins together in a product, they're going to have more functionality as it relates to gelling than either of them would have by themselves. Again, a structure where the hydrophobic sections are on the inside of the molecule and the hydrophilic sections are on the outside. And we also have a unique calcium binding site that's important with this molecule that's in the center of the molecule. The third protein, glycomacropeptide, which again I said is not really a whey protein, it's a fragment of casein, and it's produced during the cheese making process. It's only 64 amino acids because it's actually a piece of a casein fraction. It contains a high amount of carbohydrate that's actually linked to the protein that gives this peptide a very high negative charge. It has been reported in some studies to have effects on satiety as well as preventing cavities. But from a functional standpoint, an important thing to note is that it inhibits gelling and foam stability. So in some applications, if we have glycomacropeptide present, it's going to inhibit the gelation and foaming aspects of the product. Minor milk protein fractions, I'm not going to really spend hardly any time on them, but there's some additional proteins that are present at very low levels. Some of them do really have some unique characteristics, but they're going to be at very, very low levels in our product and not at levels where they really have a significance. All right, characteristics of whey protein. Why is this so intensively studied, and why do we care so much about whey proteins? What's so unique about it? One important aspect of a whey protein is that it's soluble over a wide range of pH and it's very easily dispersible. So if we want to put it in something, we can easily dissolve it, and we can do it at a wide range of pHs. In addition to that, depending on the conditions we expose it to, we can form anything from a foam to an emulsion to a thermally induced gel that can form the structural network of a lot of different food products. So we aren't just blindly adding it to a product, it's going to have a functional effect in that product, and it's going to have a role in the characteristics of that product. We've already heard about something about the nutrition quality of protein and whey protein just from a leucine perspective. But in addition to that, it's very well recognized for its superior nutritional characteristics. Mary Ann will get into the clean flavor in a little bit, so I'm not going to talk any more about that. As a result of that, it's very easy to see how you can use it to increase the protein content of an entire variety of products. Okay, a little bit on solubility. There's only one main thing I want you to get out of this slide is that as we change pH, we change charge on a protein. And I want to explain how this happens because a lot of people don't understand that. So on the left-hand bottom, I'm showing pH 9 and pH 2 of a carboxylic acid group. And you'll see on the far left, our oxygen has a negative charge at pH 9, And when we go to pH 2, it becomes protonated and our negative charge disappears. On the far right-hand side, I'm showing you amino groups that would be present on the protein. And as we go from pH 9, we have no charge. And as we go down in pH to pH 2, we have a positive charge. So when we take a protein and we go from a high pH to a lower pH, we're going to make negative charges disappear, and we're going to make positive charges appear. When that happens, the overall charge of the protein changes, and we're going to have a particular pH where the net charge on the entire protein is 0. When that occurs, we have the least solubility of our protein. So anytime we're using any type of protein in a formulation, it's really important to know what the pI or isoelectric point of that protein is and what pH the product is that we're going to be using that protein in, because it's going to have a big impact on the solubility and the characteristics of that protein. So it's something you always have to think about in a formulation. So showing that schematically, if the pH is above the pI, we're going to have a net negative charge on the protein, and when we have a net negative charge on the protein, when two proteins get close to each other, they're going to repel each other and stay in solution. If we're at the isoelectric point, we have no net charge and we're neutral, so when two proteins get close to each other, they're going to tend to stick together. Now we have the reverse effect when we go on the other side of the isoelectric point, where we can have a net positive charge, and then the proteins again will tend to stay in solution. The other thing we have to consider in any formulation is the salt content, because salt will have an impact on the solubility of this protein content as well. And at low levels of salt, we'll have something called salting in. And you'll see I'm showing positive and negative charges on the surface of the protein that act as counter ions, and at low levels will help to solubilize the protein. If we go to very high levels of salt, though, it'll cause a salting out effect, and the protein will actually fall out of solution. So to just give you an example of this and try to bring it home, if I look at the solubility of beta-lactoglobulin, which is, again, the main whey protein, and I'm showing you this at a range of pH right around, where do you think its isoelectric point is? 5.3, right, where that lowest solubility is, right? Because the solubility is going to be lowest there. And then I'm showing 4 different solutions of salt where I'm showing, and these are low concentrations of salt, where I'm seeing a salting in effect. So as I add more salt, the solubility increases. And as I go either to the right or the left of the isoelectric point of the protein, my solubility is going to increase as well. So do you understand why when I use whey protein in the formula, I want to know what my pH is going to be and what my salt content is going to be in that product, because it's going to have an effect on the solubility of that protein. Now, in addition to that, it's going to also have an impact on gelation. So in order to produce a gel from a whey protein or an egg protein, for example, what happens when we fry an egg? Goes from this liquid to a gel, right? The same thing can happen with a solution of whey protein. We can go from a liquid to a gel. The reason this occurs, remember I talked about beta-lactoglobulin and what was on the inside of that protein. We had it folded like a funnel, right? What was on the inside? Those hydrophobic groups. And when we heat it up, it opens up, and then we have 2 beta-lactoglobulin molecules that will now interact with each other and start to aggregate and form a gel. So we need heat, protein interactions, and then gel, and then we'll form a gel that may have a change in characteristics after that initial gelation. So we can get different types of gel, whether they're turbogels or clear gels, and that's impacted by how much the protein aggregates before you actually form a gel. That's influenced by the pI as well as the pH as well as the salt content or the ionic strength of our solution. So in reality, depending on the formulation we're using, we can make a gel that's white and turbid, or we can make a gel that's very elastic and clear, depending on the conditions that we actually use. Emulsification is very similar to gelation. However, we actually have the protein acting as a surfactant and interacting with the hydrophilic and hydrophobic sections of the molecule. That's just what I'm showing here. If you take oil and put it in water and you shake it up, the oil and water quickly separate once again. But if I have a protein that's present, A hydrophobic portion of the protein can interact with a fat, and the hydrophilic section can interact with the water, and I can make stable particles that are in an emulsion. A lot of our food products are an emulsion, and a whey protein can function to help form that emulsion. Foam is basically very similar to an emulsion, except we now have an air interface instead of a fat interface. So I'm just showing you a picture of how you form a foam. The proteins will stabilize the surface of that air particle, and we get our nice little latte that we formed from our stable foam. And whey proteins, again, function just like they do in a gel to do that. So in our whey protein applications, we can use them in a variety of products. And especially for baked products, they're very important when we want gelation. So we can use them in anything from cookies to pizza crust type products. In the United States, there's a big trend for gluten-free products. And whey protein is a very valuable component to use in those products to provide the texture that you would typically get in those products. So I would argue that we can still have our breakfast cereal for breakfast and get our 30 grams of protein if we've taken that cereal and we fortified it with a whey protein isolate. We're still going to get our 30 grams of protein there, and you can still have the product that you're used to having and be happy with it. We also have all kinds of beverages. That's why I spent so much time on solubility, where we can utilize whey protein. But I want to reinforce again, we got to think about the pH of that beverage and the salt content of that beverage if we want to make sure that solution is going to be stable. Other products that we commonly fortify with protein, protein bars and meat products. The gelation characteristics become very important, and the water binding characteristics. So you need to think about, again, isoelectric point, pH, and ionic strength that are in those products as we're formulating them. Now, some precautions and things you need to think about when you formulate with whey protein isolate or concentrate. The composition is very important, and the characteristics of that whey protein isolate are going to be impacted by the manufacturing process used to make them. And I talked about ion exchange, and I talked about filtration based. Even within manufacturers, they use slightly different processes, and they're going to produce whey protein isolates that are different from each other. So it's very important to look at the composition of that whey protein isolate that you're getting and what its characteristics are. You can't just go out onto the market and buy any whey protein isolate and expect it to form or to perform the same regardless of where you bought it from. How it was made becomes very important. It's important if you're writing specifications to look at performance-based characteristics because, again, they will vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. And lastly, obviously, there's instantized versions that are available, and for certain products, we want to have instantized versions of whey protein isolates available. That's as quickly as I can go through whey protein formulation, Marianne. I made it semi on time. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you have. Yeah.
Thanks for your informative talk. I saw that on the slide about alpha-lactalbumin.
Yes.
It has alpha helices, right?
Yes.
So have you come across any work where they've used whey protein to maybe encapsulate either flavor compounds or bitter molecules?
Yes, there's quite a bit of work done with that, and there's formation of nanotubes that you can make with some of these proteins, especially alpha-lactalbumin. Alpha-lactalbumin has also been noted to form complexes with linoleic acid that have some very potentially valuable anti-cancer benefits. So there's a lot of theories around with different whey protein, but I think just starting from looking at the nutritional perspective of the increased value of whey proteins, there's a strong enough argument right now to do whatever we can to get more of those in our diet right now. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned there are two different types of processing method to get whey protein isolate. So can you comment on the difference between these two methods on the protein functionality and the composition just by two different?
Okay, so starting out with, if we're making a whey protein isolate with filtration, we're going to have beta-lactoglobulin, alpha-lactalbumin, and we're going to have glycomacropeptide that are present in that molecule. And we're going to also, depending on how you operate your filtration system, we're going to have quite a few the calcium content and phosphorus content can be fairly high. The glycomacropeptide and the mineral content can have a big impact on the gelation characteristics and the thermal stability of that whey protein isolate. When you compare that to an ion exchange product, typically you'll only have beta-lactoglobulin and alpha-lactobumin in the ion exchange product, and you really won't have any calcium ions that are present. So the whey protein isolate from ion exchange is going to have higher heat stability and higher clarity in beverage type applications, and then it's also going to have increased gelation properties relative to the whey protein isolate produced by filtration. So the functionality is different between the two products. Any other questions? Yeah. Ask as many as you want. Mary Ann's just anxious.
And I've seen whey protein isolate being used quite a bit in sports nutrition powders, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Are there any challenges when it comes to hygroscopicity? Is whey protein isolate very hygroscopic? Or,
You're talking in the dried form, or
in the dried form, yes.
in the dried form? No. It's non-hygroscopic, and you really don't have any issues with it. You want to package it in a normal fashion that you would with a protein isolate. It's a valuable product, but it's not super hygroscopic like a hygroscopic whey that has lactose that's going to absorb water, because you don't have any carbohydrate there. It's essentially all protein, so it tends to be non-hygroscopic. All right, thank you.